I consider validation one of the cornerstones to good tools development. Often I've seen designers working on projects ask why they're getting a specific error from a console and then having to wait to receive an answer from a coder. Validation, if done well, will navigate that designer to a solution quickly and without having to waste someone else's time for help. So in this tutorial, I will show you how to do a few steps to get that designer to not only find the game object that has that invalid component, but also to locate the field on that component that is invalid. And all of this without having to wait till the component puts out a debug error in the log during runtime. Let me start by saying this won't be a definitive guide to all the validation I use in my projects, but it will give you enough to start creating a validation toolset that suits your project's needs. So here we have a prefab of a robot, and this is a character and uses the character component. Now, this is spawned using a manager, which instantiates it onto a spawn point within our scene. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at that manager, which is very basic for the point of this tutorial, and show how we can set up some validation to make sure that this robot has actually been assigned correctly. And if it's not correctly, how we could display that to the designer. So let's get started. Now, if you're interested in this robot character and this environment, I will make sure to stick a link in the description where you can find them on the asset store. And at the point of recording, some of these were actually on sale at the time, so go check them out. So let's stop this from playing and we can see our character disappears. And what we'll do is we'll open up the manager script to have a look at it. So let's edit the script. And we can see here, it's a very basic script for the point of this tutorial with a character prefab and a spawn point and the instantiate line to get it all started. Now, if we go back into Unity and I actually remove the robot prefab and then I press play, what we get is we get a null reference in our console. And that's basically telling us you haven't assigned a character prefab, but you're still trying to instantiate it. Now you can imagine if you're not a coder, if you're a designer or an artist or somebody else on the team, and you get this error, it doesn't make any sense. It's not going to tell you what's actually wrong with the scene itself. It's just going to tell you you need to go and speak to a coder. So let's clean that up a bit to start off with. We'll open up Visual Studio and we'll come into here, and what we'll do is we'll put an if statement in here and we'll say if the character prefab, then perform the instantiation, else, and we'll just clean up our code. We will debug log error no character prefab set. There we go. Now if I press save and I come back into Unity, we press play, and what we'll see now is we'll see the error come up, no character prefab set. And this, double clicking it, will take us to this location. So if I haven't got the manager selected and I select this, nothing happens. So here's a little trick for you. When you're doing these sort of statements in a component, make sure to add the game object to the end of it. Now, when I press play and I get this error, there we go, and I press on it, it selects the manager for me, so I know it's that one that's actually erroring. Now this, of course, is immediately better. We get a clear statement saying that no character prefab is set in our game, and we can select the manager here, and using this clear instruction, we can see that we have a problem here. Now, if this was a much bigger component with a lot more fields, then this might be harder to find. And also, if this error doesn't happen until later on in the game, even you might miss it, let's say it's on a dog leg and not on the main story, then the designer could bypass this point with never knowing it's there until a QA comes back and says, excuse me, designer, there's something wrong with the game. You need to go to this point and check it out. So a better alternative would be to tell the designer that they've done something wrong or they're missing something as soon as that point happens. And that's outside of runtime. So the way we can do that is we can actually, if we clear that and we go into validation, we can actually come into here and use the OnValidate function. Now this gets run every time a change is made to the fields in this component and also when we run the game. So what we can do is we can copy this and paste it down here. We can get rid of our else statement and we can make this negative. Get rid of our else there. Now we can save. So what's going to happen is when this starts up, it will run the OnValidate and it will give us this error. But it will also give us this if we make a change. So if I come back into Unity, clear, come to my manager, if I was to have the robot back on here, and now if I clear the robot, there we go. I've got my error straight away because the OnValidate function has run. And also if I press play, it also gets run. So again, I see I have no character prefab set and I can press this and it will select my manager item, my manager game object in my hierarchy. Now I'm pretty sure from experience that one thing you'll notice is your designers will start getting a little bit gripey with you over this change. And what's the reason for that? Well, every time I put in robots and take it away, because let's say I just wanted to swap it out, I'll be getting these errors. And every time I come in and change the spawn point, let's say I decided I didn't want a spawn point in here, I'm getting this error again. So you can imagine every time I'm making a change to this object, this manager, I'm going to be getting a lot of these errors coming through. So I just got an error, even though all I was doing was dragging and dropping the spawn point onto this location, which has nothing to do with the character prefab. So this again isn't ideal. So what we want to do is instead of throwing up this error every time we make a change, maybe we want to highlight in the hierarchy that this particular component is invalid so that the designer knows it's invalid. And then we'll progress on to mark the actual character prefab field to show it's invalid. So let's get that started now. So the first thing we want to do is we want to mark this game object, this component, as invalid. And I'm going to create an interface to show that that's actually invalid. So we'll come into our scripts folder and we'll create a new C# script. And we're going to call this iValidatable. We open that up. And this is a very simple interface. We'll call this interface. We'll get rid of the mono behavior and we'll get rid of the rest of this. And we're just going to have a simple flag that just says, are we invalid? Is this component valid? We can save that. We can come into the manager. We can use this interface, which will complain because we haven't got an invalid is valid option. We'll put the is valid in here, get, and we'll keep this as private set because we don't want anything else to know this. And in here, we'll do is valid equals m character prefab does not equal null. Okay, now we'll also want to only do this when the application is playing, because as I said, otherwise every time we make a change to this, we'll have this pop up. Now, obviously, you could be very specific in when this actually gets shown and when it doesn't get shown. But here, we're simply going to do this level of authentication because we're more interested in highlighting the hierarchy in the component. So we've taken our interface. We've produced the is valid option here, and we've put that into our OnValidate. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually write something to show up in the hierarchy. So you can see here we have the normal looking elements in our hierarchy, the items that's actually being rendered as camera with its little icon, etc. What we're going to do is we're going to actually make this item, in particular the manager, we're going to make this red whenever it's invalid. Now, to do that, we're going to write a script, and we're going to call it the validation highlighter. And this is going to be a script that takes in the callback from the hierarchy window and tells us it's doing its bit on an item, and we need to basically override that to make it look the way we want to. So this is going to be an editor script, so we're going to create it in editor. We're going to call this validation highlighter, and we'll open that up in our Visual Studio. There we go. Now, this isn't going to be a mono behavior, and we won't need any of this. What we're going to have is we're actually going to set up a static constructor. There we go, if it enables me to do that. A static constructor for validation highlighter. There we go. And let's make this nice and neat. There we are. And this is going to take the editor application class, which comes from the Unity editor library, and we're going to take the callback for the hierarchy window item on GUI event. And we're going to add our own event to this, and let's just, well, our own function called from this, and we'll just call it a similar thing with on at the beginning. And we'll generate a method from that to be called. So in here, we're going to start looking at what we've got in and whether it compares to what we want. So the first thing to do is to see, is this the object we're interested in? And that object will have a component that has the interface IValidatable. So if we put in game object equals editor utility instance ID to object, and then uses the instance ID as game object. There we go. So this gives us the object we're interested in, the item being changed by the hierarchy. So hierarchy window, when it's rendering this item, doing the on GUI on it, this is coming in and it's giving us an instance ID to each item. And we're using that instance ID, using the editor utility class to get the game object we're interested in. Now, we'll want to check that there is actually a game object there, because sometimes that will return null. And if you don't do this check before the rest of the stuff, you're going to get errors from the script that we're trying to help find errors. So the next thing to do is to see whether we've got a validatable. We do that by doing a get component IValidatable. So because our manager has this interface, we can actually use the get component method to get the component that is of that interface. Then we want to check whether, firstly, this actually exists, whether a component has actually been returned with the IValidatable interface, and also, obviously, what we're interested in, is it valid or not? And we're only interested if it's not valid. And here is where we'll start doing some of our drawing. So the first thing to do is we're going to draw a rectangle, and this will basically cover up what's already there in the item on GUI and replace it with what we want to actually replace. So there's actually an editor GUI, and it will help if I spell that correctly. Editor GUI, draw rectangle, and this actually gives us a selection rectangle here. And that's the actual item that's being drawn and the selection rectangle for that item. And then what we can do is we can actually use our own color, so in this case color red, to draw for that rectangle. And the last thing we want to do is we just want it to be registered that we've done this, and we want to repaint the hierarchy window. There we go. So let's save this. But before we begin, the only way that Unity knows that it's going to have to run this static constructor and apply this callback to enable us to call this function is to make sure that we use the attribute up here, initialize on load, which will call this. So let's save and go back into Unity. So as you can see, our manager has been overwritten with this big red bar. We can still select it, but we know it's not valid. If we put robot in here, that will clear because it's a valid option. Now, obviously, we're not going to keep it as a big red bar because that destroys the whole, what is this object? It's a manager. How would we know there's a big red bar being drawn over it? So let's tidy up the drawing and make this a lot neater. Okay, so first off, let's draw our label field. So we're going to do, if I can spell it right, editor GUI dot draw label field, sorry. And we're going to give it the selection rectangle, and we're going to give it the name of our object to draw, and then we're going to give it a GUI style. So we'll do GUI style. And we'll just call this, I don't know, text style. I'll say that's a new GUI style. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually use the current style for labels. So we'll just do GUI skin.label, but we'll override the text color, and we're going to set this color to red. Because what we're going to do is we're going to actually change this background, and we're going to have this background feature exactly the same as it does in the hierarchy as it is. Because if we remove this rectangle right now, and then I was to use the text style here and come back into Unity, what you would see is manager being drawn over this. And obviously that doesn't look right at all. We want that draw rectangle, but we want it to be the same color as these colors here. So we'll come back in and we'll say, right, what's the background color? Color, background color, there we are, equals. Now, there's 4 colors that we're actually concerned with here. One, whether this skin is dark or light, whether the person using Unity has decided to use the Pro skin, the dark version of Unity interface, or whether they're using the non-Pro skin, which is the light version of the interface. So firstly, we want to know which one they're using and associate the color correctly. And then the next thing we want to know is this item in the hierarchy selected? Because if it's selected, it needs to be blue. It needs to have a blue tint to it. Now, I could just start writing all that in, but I actually have these already to the side here. So I'm just going to copy and paste these in so I don't have to write out all these numbers and you have to sit here waiting. But you can pause this video at any point and grab these numbers for these colors. And we can see the standard color, the color when using the Pro skin, the selected color, and the selected color when using the Pro skin. Now, the next thing we're interested in is the Pro skin. So editor GUI utility dot is Pro skin. So as we've said, if it is the Pro skin, then we'll use the Pro color. Otherwise, we'll use the normal color. Now we need to know if this object has been selected. Well, the easiest way of doing that is up the top here. Let's put in is selected as a flag. We'll go selection dot instance IDs, and we'll check whether these instance IDs contain the instance ID that we're interested in. Now, the contains actually comes from the link library, the system link library. So that's where we get that from. So now we know whether it's been selected. So what we'll do is we'll say if is selected background color equals, and again, we'll double check for the pro skin, and we'll use the selected pro and the selected non-pro. So there we go. Now I have the colors that I'm interested in. So now if I come back to here and I use the background color and I press save, coming back into Unity, we can see managers come up nice and clear. And what this is having, you can actually see the dark gray here where I'm highlighting, but when I actually select it, it stays as blue. Now beforehand, that would have been that big red bar, which wouldn't have made sense. But we can clearly see that manager has a problem in this format. But I still don't quite like the fact that there's this massive bar when we're hovering over. And also, we're missing out on our little icons. And if these are changed in any way, we won't see that here. So let's fix those issues. So the first thing to do is to make sure that this rectangle is drawn limited, so it's not going right across. And what we'll do is we'll put this under here. And for good reason, we're going to do this after the GUI style. Because GUI style, if you see my other videos, has this great option called calculate size. If I spell it correctly, there we go, calculate size. And we can pass it the content we're actually interested in, which is object name. And this will give us the size of the actual rectangle that would hold this particular text. And we can just say float width equals that there. Now, what we can do is we can actually set our rectangle, our background rectangle, to be that. But we'll want to make a new rectangle so we don't mess with anything else. Background rect. We'll start off with the selection rectangle, but then we'll actually set the background rect.width to be the width we're actually interested in. And obviously we'll change that option in here. So the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we skip the icon. And all we want to do there is we want to use the selection rectangle, the rectangle that will be drawn, and we want to make sure we shift it across. So we can do that up the top here. We can say selection rectangle where it begins on the X, and all we can do is we add a little bit extra on the side here. And I already know what this is from testing, and we're going to have it as 18.5. So we set that there, and we come back into Unity. And now we can see we have our little icon. And also when we're hovering, our background is actually just that little dark part. So now we can press blue and it looks like anything else from the item. And we can still move it. We can still do everything else with it. But we know there's an error because it's marked as red. And again, we could pop robot into here and now it's not marked anymore because it's valid. And then it's invalid. So immediately as a designer, I can look at my scene, my hierarchy and go, oh, I know there's a problem there. That item is invalid. But let's go one stage further. I know this is invalid, but let's say there's a lot of items on here, a lot of fields that are being filled in, and I have to find which one is the one that's actually broken, the one that is not valid. Well, we can do this by using a property attribute and then a property drawer class to actually draw around this character prefab to show that this is the one we're actually interested in. So the first thing we actually have to do is we have to set up an attribute. And I actually just recently put out a video on custom attributes using the property attribute class. So you might want to go and check that out for even more information once you've actually watched this video. So we'll start off, we'll create a C# script, and we're going to call this one validation attributes. And within validation attributes, we're going to get rid of our monobehavior items. And this one actually derives, if I do it correctly, from property attributes. And all we need to know in the property attribute is a string of text. And this is going to be the text that's used to be displayed when we have an invalid item. And because we know we're always going to want this, we'll set up a constructor that actually takes in the text here. There we go. So this is our attribute. And we can actually come into the manager now, go to our character prefab and set here validation. And we can put into here character, spell it correctly, character prefab is required. This is the text we're interested in displaying if this is caused to be invalid. So we'll save both of those. We'll come back into Unity. Now nothing will be displayed yet because we need to write a property drawer. So we'll come into the editor, we'll create a new C# script, and we're going to call this validation drawer. We'll open that up in Visual Studio. We'll get rid of the monobehavior stuff because we don't need it. And we're going to type into here property drawer, which comes from the Unity editor library. Now we have to tell Unity which custom property we're actually interested in. So custom property drawer, and then type of, and then the attribute we're interested in, validation attribute. There we go. So there are two pieces of functionality. And again, I have a video about all of this, so I'm going to skip through quite quickly how I create this. So I'll be racing down this code and you can see, I'll make some comments as I'm doing it, but the other video I've done is a lot more in detail about this. So the first one we're going to override is we're going to override the get property height. And the other one we're going to override is the on GUI. Now, what we're going to create is we're going to create a little help box, and we're going to also highlight the whole property in red. So I'm going to do some constants here for padding these boxes out. So we're going to do box padding equals 10, and then we're going to do general padding. It's a float, and we're going to make that equal 10 as well. And then let's jump in. We'll put in an offset to 20, just to give it some width around it, some height around it to offset other things inside. Now we're going to need to store the height of the box and the height of the help box that we're going to create inside, because we're going to set those up in our get property height, but we're actually also going to be using them in our on GUI. So we're going to keep that for the time being. But what we're going to do here is we're going to work out whether our property is broken or not, whether it's valid or not. Now, in an extensive set of validation tools, what you would do here is you would actually derive some classes and say, okay, this is a float validation, this is an object validation, these are the parameters I want for those particular validation, this is where it lies out, this is where it comes together. And we're doing the very simple version here where we say, if the property dot object reference value is equal to null, then do our drawing, or well, set our height, otherwise do the normal. And we're going to do the same thing down in GUI. So this is the really simple version because we're just concerned as to whether we have an object set. But as I say, if you were using a float field or you were using some custom field, you might have some more detailed validation here, and you'd probably put that in another class and reference that into here. So you could go ahead and do that, but obviously that would take up a lot more video than I could do here. So I'm giving you the basics and the base of this validation. Now we're going to do the same sort of thing in the onGUI. We're basically going to say if the property, if this reference value, so I'm just going to do this, else there, that's null, then that's what we're interested in. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the validation attributes that we set up, and we want to get this, and it's basically using the attribute that's available under our property drawer, and we're just going to basically cast this. So we don't have to keep referencing this as all the way down. We're going to do this in both areas. Now we're going to set up a GUI style like we did previously, but we'll just call this one style. And we're going to take from the editor styles, if I spell correctly, there we go, editor styles, help box, because this is the help box that we're basically going to be filling in. We'll set up some alignment, and we'll set that to middle left. We're going to make sure that's word wrapped. And we're going to set some padding around the wording because otherwise it's all really bunched up and quite awful. So we'll use a rect offset here, and we'll just use the box padding we set up above. And the box padding, and the box padding, and the box padding, and there's 4 of these because it's all around the square. There we go. And also, because the normal help box is titchy text, we're going to make it a little bit bigger. So now we want to find out what the height is of this box. So we'll do style, and we're going to calculate the height, new GUI content, and this is going to be the attribute text, and for the width of the, that's the width of the inspector, but you call it screen width because it takes the screen that it's currently on. Next one we want to set up is the height, which is the help box height plus the actual base, the property height we get from calling the property drawer property height, and then we're just going to add some offset onto that. There we go, and we'll return height. Now the reason we have the extra height variable there is because we still need to draw the property under the help box. So we draw the help box, we draw the height of the property, and then we draw some offset because this is for coloring a rectangle all around it. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually draw some of these boxes. So we're going to take the position, the height. So the position is the rectangle that you'll be drawing within on the onGUI. We're going to set the height of that to the help box height. We're going to set the Y of that to be, to add some padding. Oh, okay, padding. We're going to take half the padding, obviously, and this should be plus equals, the minus there, I don't know why I put that in. There we go, and this is where we draw our help box. So editor GUI dot help box. We draw at the position that we've just altered. We're going to add the text to it, and because this is a validation, we're going to set it to error because we're only doing this if the current reference is null. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to draw the color box. This is going to be the full height, and editor GUI dot draw rectangle we're interested in, and we're going to set this to a new color. Now the color of this is going to be a kind of a faint red. Oh, to F, put some F's in here, there we go. And we're going to make it pretty transparent because we just want to highlight, we don't want to go mental, we don't want to hurt people's eyes when they try and read this thing. And then we actually want to draw the property. This is, when I say property, this is the actual property field that would be drawn normally if we weren't overriding it. And we want to draw this a little bit below our help box. So we'll go into here and we'll say the help box height plus some padding. And then we want to set the height for this to be the base height. The get property height. Property label. And this is actually from the base because it's the standard property field that we're going to draw. We want to get the height from the base without all the rest of this code above. We want to get it nice and pure, nice and clean. And then we're actually going to draw the property. Property field, put the position in, put the property in, and the GUI content, which will be the property display name, and that'll be it. There we go. And we'll also do this instead of doing the base. So there we are. Nice and neat. So all we're doing here is, as you can see, we're moving the position and we're changing the heights to create the rectangle that we're drawing the help box, the rectangle, the red rectangle behind the help box, and the standard property field. So we can see that we have it red in the hierarchy. And then if I press on it, the manager, we can see that there we go. The character prefab is quite heavily identified as a problem area. So now I can drop the robot in there and it comes back to normal. So if I clear down and I delete this, I can still press play and have errors come up. So there's still an error telling me no character prefab, and I can still select that and come into here and I can see where the problem is. But I don't have that problem of every time I change something, if I clear this, every time I change something like the spawn point, if I change this to none, I don't have this error coming up telling me that there's a problem. Clear that to none. Now if I put spawn point in there, it's not giving me that error on validate, because why would I want it to? I'm doing something else in this component. I'm not round to that setup. But I can quite clearly see that there's a problem with this component that needs resolving, and that problem is just sticking the robot in. So now when I'm performing as a designer, I can clearly see, okay, my manager's got a problem. I come in, I could see where the error is. I could read the text, and that's the text we wrote in our attribute on our manager. That's the text here. And that's the text that gets passed through the validation attribute and onto our validation drawer and is drawn as the attribute text upon our message, our help box here. And that's the red rectangle behind it that we see here. So that's it for this tutorial. We've covered a number of areas here, including the OnValidate function, highlighting things in the hierarchy, and also using property drawer to indicate a missing component in our inspector. Now, you can expand the skills here to cover other types of fields that could be invalid because of the current configuration or lack thereof. You could also use this highlighting in the hierarchy to put in tabs or something else, or groupings, by having big boxes or special items marked out as yellow, etc. This gives you This tutorial has given you a lot of insights into a lot of different parts. And as I said at the very beginning, it's not a definitive guide to putting validation throughout the entire Unity. That depends on how your project's set up and what you're doing with it. But this hopefully has given you a base, a structure to go in and perform some validation entries and to play with these areas in order to expand your tools knowledge and also your knowledge of how Unity works in the background. So overall, I hope you found this video useful and it got all your tools aspirations energized. If so, hit the like button for me. And if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching.